So this is part one of the React tutorial, Introduction to React for beginners. And so I'm going to start off just giving a kind of fundamental explanation of React. What's the kind of core component of React? The core kind of elements of React. But I want to start off by first discussing normal HTML. And so I think a lot of people, when they learn programming, they learn JavaScript and then React. They would have got some experience with how things work without React, without using the React framework. So that when you want to make a web page without React, um, you would have definitely seen something like this, which is the very standard, the most basic HTML document. And so this is how you make web pages without React. You have to have a HTML file. And in that HTML file, you have this HTML markup. And so this is, this is very basic. You might normally have more things in there, but the kind of main thing to kind of show, the main thing to kind of understand is the stuff in this body tag, which is this is how you get elements on a web page. And so this on an actual web page looks like this, right? So this is my index.html. And so how does this kind of work? How does stuff get painted onto the browser? HTML takes the tags that you put in your HTML file, and it reads the tags, and then it reads the thing inside the tags, and it understands how to kind of portray that on the screen. And so it knows that a H1 is a heading, and so it has a big font, and a paragraph is on a new line, so that goes on a new line, and that kind of stuff. And then if you inspect this web page, if you've ever done this, you can see that HTML replicated. So this is literally how the browser turns it into the actual web page is kind of the same structure as what you write. Your HTML, your browser is kind of reading that, and it's painting that onto the screen. So this is, this is the kind of the normal way, the old school way, or the original way of how we did web pages, just using HTML. And so comparing that to React, this is what the React version of the equivalent thing looks like. I'm going to put these side by side and we'll compare them. And so this here on the right is pretty much everything you need. There's a couple of things, but I'll explain that as I go along. But this is pretty much most of what you need in order to replicate the same thing. And if I demonstrate, I can demonstrate what that looks like. So this is the React version. So pretty much the same thing. And this is the code for it. So let's kind of go through this step by step and let's kind of explain through this example, comparing it to how we understand normal HTML. What is React and how does it work? What is happening inside of React? How do we write React code? How do we get web pages using React? And so first thing to note, the main core of this is this function. And so this is a JavaScript function. And an important thing to note, first of all, is that we're in a JavaScript file, not in a HTML file. So React, first of all, the main core of things is JavaScript files and not HTML files. But you can see here, so we've got this JavaScript function. So this is a normal JavaScript function. If you've done JavaScript, you'll have seen this kind of syntax: function name, curly brackets, return. Same as normal JavaScript, any other JavaScript function. The different thing here is that what we're returning is HTML. And so that's the first thing to know about React, is that React uses JavaScript to return HTML. Whereas in the old school way of doing things, you have a HTML file which can only have HTML in it. And here you can't exactly write a JavaScript, right? You can't do function app. That's not really how it works. You could put that in a script tag, but it's not quite the same thing, right? As mixing them in the way that we're doing here. So this is actually a JavaScript function which returns HTML. And this function, these lines, so this function and then this line here, in that is a combination that returns you the equivalent of what's happening on the left side. And so first of all, we've got a JavaScript function which is returning some HTML. And then we've got this line. And so there's quite a few things going on here. Let's go through this step by step. First of all, you've got this React DOM thing. What is this? So here we've got on the top, we've got import React DOM from React-DOM. And so this is, first of all, called an import statement. And if you don't know about importing or exporting in JavaScript, you can basically import variables that are being exported from another file. So you can write your like JavaScript code, and then you can have like a variable. For example, this app function. So this is a function stored in the variable name app. We could export that. Export default app, right? And so that basically means that any other file could import this function, and then it would have access to this function, and it could, call this function or use this function, whatever, as if it was like in, this was in scope of that other file. So you can kind of throw around variables between files. So you can use variables in other files. So it's defined here, but you could use it in another file. And so that's what's happening here. This React DOM is actually coming from another file, which is actually a file that has been created by a JavaScript library called React DOM. And so if you don't know anything about JavaScript libraries, basically in React projects, you can include, and this is also works in Node projects if you ever done Node, but you can include other people's code, and so other people will write kind of what's called a library, which is they'll write code that does stuff, and then you can import their code and use their code. So they've kind of pre-written code. And so here there's this library called React DOM. So that's React, part of the React library. So obviously we're in React, we're writing React. In order for us to write React, we have to, at some point, utilize the React library. And so React is a library. React is a library that React team has written code, and they have exported some variables, some objects, or some functions or whatever, and then we can import that and we can do stuff with that. And so basically this line here is us using React. And so what that means is that we write our function that returns our HTML, and then we pass that into this function of this React DOM variable, this React DOM, which is an object because it's React DOM dot. So there's a render function on this object that when we pass it our app function, it will take this HTML that's being returned, and it will paint that on the screen on the browser. So that's how that works, right? So this HTML markup gets put on the browser by React. So React takes it and it puts it on the browser, and the way that React picks up your code is through this line. And so that's what React DOM.render is. This app thing here is a little bit interesting because when I say we pass the app function, this looks like a HTML tag. And so this is another element of React, which is that when we write a function that returns HTML, for us to use that function to what's called render the HTML, or for that HTML to be displayed, we have to write it like a custom HTML tag. So as if we made a new HTML tag with that name. So this is how kind of React has created their library, that when you write your JavaScript function and return your HTML, instead of calling that function, you actually write it like a HTML tag, like a custom tag. And there's reasons for that, and that will kind of be explained as we go along. But that's the kind of that's the format of things. So this is how we pass in the app. We render it by writing it as a custom. And you can think of this as like, so like a H1 tag takes, the text you put inside of it, and then it renders like, something in big font and that kind of stuff. So like the H1 does stuff on your browser. So you can think of the app as the same thing. Like this app tag, what is it? It's just a tag that will display a div with a H1 and a P in it. It's just like we're just creating custom HTML tags. And this is the definition of what that HTML tag is. And then the second parameter of this react-dom.render function. So what is this? Document.getElement by ID root. So if you've done vanilla JavaScript, you'll recognize this document.getElement by ID, which is what this is saying is I want to find the element in our HTML that has the ID of root. And so what react-dom.render is doing is it's finding the element on our page that has the ID of root. And it says render, put this thing here inside of root. So that's how this code gets on the page, is that it finds the root, the element that has the ID of root, and it paints it on the page by putting it as a child of root. And so what element are we talking about? Like, what is this element with root? So if you see here, we've got this div. So we've got the body tag as normal. So if the index of HTML, right, we have a body tag, and then we had our H1 and our P. So that's what we'd written here, right? Here we've got like our div and our H1 and our P. But we've also got this. So that's our div. This is our div, our H1 and our P. But we've got this other div which is called root. It's always got an ID of root. So where's that coming from? So this is actually the one thing that React, one of the few things that React sets up for you, or you need to have set up already, is this index.html file inside of our React app. So in our React app folder, and I won't show the folder structure in this video, but I'll go into that later. So I just want to cover the basics. But we do have to have still an index.html file, but we don't write any of our HTML inside of that. The only thing we do is we have this div with the ID of root. And then all the rest of our HTML gets written inside our JavaScript files. But we need to have this one div just so that our JavaScript file, when we call our react-dom.render function, knows it has like an entry point in the HTML. So it just has to have one entry point, and then everything else, all the rest of our application code, is going to come from here. It's going to come from this function. So all the rest of our HTML is going to be returned inside of this app. And so that's basically the fundamentals, right, of React. How you make a web page in React. You just have to put it inside of a function, a JavaScript function in a JavaScript file, and then you want that function to be rendered as a custom HTML tag. So written as a custom HTML tag, and that's passed into the react-dom.render function. And so that's it. I mean, that's how you create a basic HTML page in React. And so that kind of explains, I mean, the fundamental, but the kind of the big question that comes from this, apart from this isn't like a real example, so show me a real example. But to get to that, we need to understand a few questions. And the next question to kind of understand is, or the first question to understand is, why do we have to put our HTML in a JavaScript function? What is the reason for doing it this way? What's the benefit of writing things like this instead of this, where, I mean, seems a little bit complicated, more complicated, it seems a little bit obtuse. Why we do things like this and not like this? What's the benefits? And so in the next video, I'll go into that and I'll start to explain the reasons why React was created, why React wants us to put HTML in a JavaScript function and in JavaScript files, and how that benefits us.